Well, colleagues, let me welcome all of you here very warmly to the Paul Cadario Conference Centre. For those of you who were here this morning, we had an official opening of this remarkable space. And now we get into the real purpose of why a space like this was built, which is that we might get together and talk about big and pressing issues and might learn from one another. My name is Peter Lowen. I'm the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. I have the real honor of doing that job, and it's an honor for a couple of reasons. One is that get to traffic in ideas on a regular basis, and the other is we get to do it with people who are very special as academics, but also special as friends of the Munk School. And today we're doing this symposium in honor of the opening of this space, which of course is named in honor of Paul Cadario. So before we kick off the introduction with Robert, I just wanted you to join me in having a really rousing round of applause to thank Paul for his remarkable generosity. I do want to acknowledge the land on which University College sits and the Munk School sits and the University of Toronto sits. This has for centuries been the traditional home of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and more recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we sit right on the old Tattle Creek, which explains the fecundity of all the land here around U of T. And it's also a great intellectual heritage for us to inherit. So we're very lucky to be here, to live and to work and to play and to thrive on this little part of Turtle Island. We're talking today about the future of democracy in the United States. I don't think any of us know exactly what the future of the US should be, but I think we all know that it matters. And whatever particular path the United States decides to chart or unthinkingly charts over the coming years is going to matter, not only for the 300 million plus people who live in the United States, but certainly for us here in Canada, and also for people around the world. We're at the Munk School convinced that it's important that we do some unthinkable thinking about what the future of the US could be, reflect on what the response of people within the United States to that should be, and indeed what the response should be of US allies and in other countries, companies, universities, other institutions, and citizens around the world in response to what will be potentially highly turbulent future. So we have a multi-year project working on this at the Munk School, and today's really a public kickoff of that project. And we're so pleased we've been able to assemble what really is an all-star cast of observers of American politics and American society from around the world, from the United States and from Germany and from Australia, and indeed from here in Canada as well. So the order of operations today is we're going to have a keynote from Rob Lieberman, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment. And following that, we'll invite you to engage in a Q&A with Rob, and we'll have a nice lunch. And then we'll have a couple of panels, one on the future of the global order and the United States' role in it, and a second on the future of domestic politics in the United States. And you'll see in your program just what a great group we have assembled for that. Things are being kicked off by Rob Lieberman, who is the Krieger-Eisenhower Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. He is a leading scholar of what we sometimes call American political development, the study of the historical evolution of American society and American politics. His most recent book is a very important one called Four Threats: The Recurring Crises in American Democracy. And when you hear that title, it gives you a hint about why why we're so lucky to have Rob Lieberman with us here today, because he, I think, is seized by questions about what the future of American politics might be, but he approaches those with a deep historical understanding of the recurrences that keep coming back in the United States, and patterns that we keep seeing, which have over time and today posed major crises to American democracy. So I won't say anything more except that we couldn't have someone better to kick off this conference than Rob Lieberman. I invite him to come up and give his talk, Backsliding in Reverse: Reflections on Democratic Fragility and Resilience. And I ask you to join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to Rob Lieberman.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Peter, for that terrific introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here talking at the opening of this beautiful facility, and I think it's sadly a great topic to be inaugurating this kind of facility. It's a topic where we need a lot of careful thought and conversation, and exactly the kind of interchange and discussion that this kind of space can facilitate. So thanks for having me. I'm going to talk about a number of things. I'm going to begin with a little bit of a shameless plug. Peter set me up perfectly for this, based on work that I've done with my colleague at Cornell, Suzanne Mettler, which we identified historically 4 key threats to democracy. As I said, when Suzanne and I started to write this book after the 2016 election, when students of American politics, as you can imagine, had a bit of a, the politest way I can put it, is an eye-opening moment. And we talk with, after the election of Donald Trump in 2016, Suzanne and I would talk with colleagues in the hall who study comparative politics. And they'd say things to us like, oh yeah, democracies come and go. We had a pretty good run in the United States. Or they'd get all excited, their eyes would get wide, and they'd say, ooh, this is just like what happened in, fill in the blank, Turkey, Venezuela, Hungary. And I'm thinking, oh, good Lord. So what we try to do in this work is to think about what we can learn from studying other countries where democracy has risen and fallen over time, about things that threaten features of democratic societies that threaten the stability of democracy. And there are really 4, these are the 4 threats of the title: political polarization, what we call conflict over membership, over the boundaries of membership in society, which in the United States expresses itself most commonly over race and immigration, high and rising economic inequality, and executive aggrandizement, the increasing executive power, concentration of power in a single individual, as opposed to power being distributed over institutions and multiple people, which is sort of the way we used to think about the design of American politics, right? And historically, I'm compressing a long and complex book into 2 slides. Historically, and in the book, we study a series of previous episodes of what we call democratic fragility, moments when it seemed as if the United States was in danger of losing forward progress toward a more complete democracy. I can say more about those in the Q&A. And you can see that every single prior episode has had some combination or one or more of these threats. Today, we're in a position where, for the first time in American history, we face all 4 of these threats at the same time. This is a story about a sort of dangerous convergence of historical conditions that makes the United States in the 2010s and 2020s particularly ripe for exactly the kind of things that we're seeing today. These are the conditions that give rise to leaders like Donald Trump. We see Trump as a symptom rather than a cause of American fragility. So just to give you a sort of quick overview of what these threats look like today, polarization, these are probably for many of you familiar pictures. These are pictures of essentially ideology scores of members of Congress. On the left, you have the distance between the average Democrat and the average Republican in Congress in terms of ideology. So lower numbers mean the parties are closer together. Higher numbers mean the parties are farther apart. And you can see that over the last 50 years or so, the parties have grown farther apart. Another way to look at the same data on the right is Republicans on the top and Democrats on the bottom, sort of average Republican on the top, average Democrat on the bottom. The scale, this particular measure has higher numbers are more conservative, lower numbers are more liberal. And you can see, again, parties moving farther apart. So this is one of the conditions that leads to this sort of inability of the democratic system in the United States to work the way we used to think it worked. That is, push toward the center, push toward compromise, push toward consensus. That becomes harder and harder as the parties move farther apart. That's true among elites. It's also true among the public. These are data that show what we call a feeling thermometer, right? A survey question, how warmly or coolly do you feel toward fill in the blank, right? High numbers are very warm feelings, low numbers are very cold feelings. And these are when we ask people, Americans, about to locate their own party. So Democrats being asked about Democrats, Republicans being asked about Republicans. You get the line on the top, right? So people feel pretty warmly about their own party, and that's been pretty consistent since the 1970s. That's as far back as these data go. The bottom line, the solid line at the bottom, is how people feel about the opposing party, right? And their feelings have gotten much colder. People are increasingly motivated, not so much by warm feelings toward their own party, but by hatred of the other party. Right. The best analogy I can give is as a sports fan. You know, I grew up in New England. I'm a fan of the Boston Red Sox. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that in Toronto. But so I like it when the Red Sox win, but I really like it when the Yankees lose. Right. So that's the best analogy I can come up with. But so the point is polarization, the sort of antagonism and incommensurability between the parties is a problem, not just at the elite level, not just among elected officials, but among the broader public too. These are just a little wisps of data that sort of are indicators of the threats that we're describing. Increasingly, partisan polarization has come to overlap and interact with racial antagonism. This is a measure, these are measures of what's called racial resentment, which is a contemporary way of measuring racially antagonistic attitudes. And what you see is the top dotted line is Republicans, white Republicans, the bottom dashed line is white Democrats. And the thing to notice on this graph is that that the gap in racial resentment between white Democrats and white Republicans has grown. So that increasingly partisan polarization and partisan antagonism, which I showed you on the previous slides, intersects with and overlaps with racial antagonism and racial conflict. And this has been in previous episodes of democratic fragility and breakdown in the United States, a very toxic combination. Think about the Civil War, think of the 1890s, and conflict, and especially in the American South, that led to mass disenfranchisement of African Americans across the South after they had had voting rights protected for several decades after the Civil War. Rising economic inequality, this is probably a familiar picture to you. This is one way of measuring inequality, which we have this long data series for, this is the share of total income that goes to the top 1% of income earners. You can see at the beginning of the 20th century, things were pretty unequal. In the middle of the 20th century, essentially from World War II until the 1970s and 1980s, things got somewhat more equal. Inequality has risen dramatically in the last 30 or 40 years to the point where income in the United States is now as unequal or more unequal than it was in the beginning of the 20th century, right? Another feature of democratic crises, especially the upward slope. I don't have a picture for executive aggrandizement because it's hard to come up with data to measure the concentration of power in a democratic political system. But I think over time, we've seen presidents growing in power and presidents accruing more power to themselves as the rest of the political system gets more kludgy and difficult to operate, right? When Congress can't agree because of the polarization that we've already talked about, presidents who find themselves increasingly tempted to use tools of executive power to sidestep or get around blockages in the rest of the political system. And again, the combination of increasing executive power and polarization, partisan polarization, increases both the temptation and the opportunity for a partisan president to use the power of his office, not just to promote a policy agenda, but also to punish the other side and to try and lock in partisan gains in power. And that's a lot of what we've seen in the last few years. So what does this mean for democratic backsliding in the United States? There are a lot of ways to think about the sort of decline of what we used to think of as the model of democratic politics and policymaking in the United States. I won't read every word on this slide, but cross-cutting cleavages, the idea that people belong to multiple different communities that sort of intersect and are somewhat fluid. That model of American pluralism has declined, and we increasingly find Americans sorting themselves into non-overlapping, mutually exclusive communities, identity communities. Partisanship has become an identity. Partisanship, we used to think of partisanship as the sort of consequence of other identities. I'm a member of a labor union, or I'm a suburbanite, or I have this other identity, and my partisanship, the way I vote and the way I express myself politically, is a consequence of these other things, right? Increasingly, research has shown that partisanship itself has become a core part of people's social and political identity. And it coincides with these other things, racial and religious and cultural identities, where you live, where you go to school, where you go to church, all of those things sort of add up to a picture of a society that does not operate in the same democratic way that certainly my colleagues and I who study American politics used to sort of assume. I teach the big introductory undergraduate course in American politics. I first started teaching this course in the 1990s, dropped it for a while, and then came back to it in the last few years. And I thought, oh, well, this will be easy. I'll just dust off my old notes from 1995. I'll cross out Clinton. I'll write in Trump, and everything will be fine. It turned out, I feel like I now need to go back to track down all of my undergraduate students from the 1990s and offer them their tuition money back, because almost everything I told them was, as the president of the United States would say, malarkey. The way we model or understand American politics has dramatically changed. So where do we look for democratic resilience? Are we on a sort of inexorable slide into some kind of authoritarianism? Is this model of democracy that we used to be very familiar with gone forever? There are maybe some little wisps of resilience, right? Congress has, on the one hand, Congress has become, as I said, a very kludgy, kind of gridlocked institution. It's very hard to create grand cross-partisan coalitions, which was the 20th century model for how policymaking in the United States happened under our old model of democracy. There's maybe little wisps of evidence, if you look at it just squinty-eyed in the right light, just the right way, that there are moments of something that looks like bipartisanship in Congress. During the pandemic, for example, there was convergence on some major relief actions, big infrastructure act that was passed last year. The second Trump impeachment, not the first Trump impeachment, actually got some Republicans to cross the line. Most of those people have now seen their political careers come to a crushing end, so I'm not sure how much of that we're going to see in the future. There was, I'm not sure how much we should be celebrating 3 Republicans voting for a Supreme Court nominee of a Democratic president, but the way things are going, 3 is something, right? Because the expected value of that number is 0 these days. So maybe wisps of a little bit of cross-partisanship in Congress. I don't know how much to make of that. And if this is going to continue, that's going to depend on people being willing to put themselves on the line the way these, say, 10 Republicans or handful of Republicans who voted to impeach Trump did. And most of them, politically speaking, have come to a bad end, at least in the short term. Either they decided to retire or they were defeated by more conservative Republicans in a primary. The 2020, some people might say 2020 election was itself an indicator of democratic resilience. The system held. Turnout was extremely high. It turns out Donald Trump is a great voter turnout tool, for both parties. This election, in the middle of a global pandemic, when going out in public to vote in a crowded polling place didn't seem like a good idea. This election had the highest turnout in an American national election since 1900, which is quite remarkable. States really successfully adapted to the pandemic. It was, you know, despite what you might have read in the newspaper, an election conducted with essentially zero credible fraud, and claims of fraud were universally and uniformly rejected by the courts. State election officials resisted the pressure to do all kinds of nefarious things. This is our everyone's best friend now, Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State of Georgia, who Trump had a notorious phone call with. So maybe there's a moment of resilience there, right? The system held, although when we think about what's going on under the hood in election systems in the United States, it's not clear that this is repeatable, especially if states are able to reform election laws and if the Supreme Court caves into this independent state legislature theory, which says that doesn't matter what voters do, state legislatures can run presidential elections however they want. Maybe a little bit of rejection of partisan gerrymandering. These are a couple of states where partisan districting, an attempt to sort of lock in partisan gains at the state level, were rejected. Is a Democratic example. North Carolina on the right is a Republican example. So this is happening on both sides. The Republicans have gotten really good at this in the last 10 or 20 years, but Democrats have been really good at it for a long time. You know, but again, you know, it's not, there's still a fair bit of this going on. And in Ohio, the state Supreme Court rejected a Republican gerrymander, and the state is running the election with those districts that the Supreme Court rejected anyway. They're ignoring the ruling of the court. So it's not clear how much of an indicator of resilience even this is. And then popular movements. So there was a little upsurge in 2020 of Black Lives Matter after the George Floyd incident in Minnesota. That's on the left. On the right is a pro-choice rally from before. I guess from right after the Dobbs decision in the spring. So maybe there's a hint of hopefulness in popular revolt or popular uprising or mobilization, although on the Black Lives Matter point, racial attitudes, which showed in 2020 a softening of antagonism, have gone back to where things were before 2020, right? So we're no better off in terms of the white attitudes about racial conflict and racial resentment than we were before 2020. So there are things that people will say that say, oh, well, you know, Congress is behaving in a normal way, or there's all this popular mobilization. But I think we need to be a little bit skeptical about whether these things are really strong platforms by themselves for resilience. So the question is, what is the recipe for democratic resilience, for the resistance of backsliding, for reversing backsliding? You know, are we just in a sort of self-reinforcing cascade? Is it possible to interrupt the cycle of backsliding, right? These threats that I indicated, that I identified before still exist. They're still there, right? None of those measures that I showed you early on has changed very much since 2020, right? And and even if we could reverse some of those threats or turn toward a different picture of the context of American politics, is that by itself enough to halt this sort of self-reinforcing, what seems to be a self-reinforcing cascade of backsliding? One thing to note, one of the most disturbing things that Suzanne and I sort of pieced together as we were writing that book is that the resolution of these incipient democratic crises in American history is often involved reversals of racial equality. So we can save democracy. But often the way we save democracy is by saving democracy for white Americans and leaving African Americans and others off to the side. The best example of this was the 1890s. This is a picture from Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, where there was essentially a coup d'etat against a biracial Republican and populist state government. That was essentially a coup that was advanced by the Democratic Party and white supremacist militias affiliated with the Democratic Party. This is them standing proudly in front of the wreckage of the office of a black daily newspaper in Wilmington that they had burned as part of this really a coup. They rounded up the elected leaders of the city and either arrested them or forced them out of town and installed their own white Democratic leadership. That was sort of the harbinger of what happened, often less violently around the South, right? Throwing out and removing Black political power from the recipe in the South, which lasted for 60 years. So again, is the absence of threats sufficient? So in the last couple of minutes, I just want to talk very quickly about the way that I'm trying to think, and I think it might be fruitful to think about how we can recapture some democratic energy in the United States. And the way I want to think about this is to look, and I'll do this very, very quickly, look at some historical episodes of democratization in the United States. And particularly what I want to call racial democratization, right? Democratization that begins to or tries to embrace the multiracial and multi-ethnic and diverse character of American society, right? And there are really two instances of this in American history. The first, what we call the first and second Reconstructions, Reconstruction after the Civil War, and what the historian C. Vann Woodward called the second Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Revolution of the middle of the 20th century. That's Lyndon Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 there. So as I said, these two episodes were the first Reconstruction, in which you can see the protection of civil rights and voting rights. And this is what I want to emphasize about Reconstruction. The federal government and even the Army stepping in. So down on the southeast corner of this slide, you see a picture of this is our Union Army officer, sort of literally standing in between angry groups of Black and white citizens and keeping them apart. The federal government was instrumental in not just keeping the peace, but in protecting rights and in protecting the process of democratization for several decades. Similarly, in the second Reconstruction, again, these are pictures of moments when the federal government, when the state was instrumental in promoting the progress of democratization, from Brown versus Board of Education to, again, that's the Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act, the use of the military in Iraq and the University of Mississippi, the Justice Department, the executive order. This is a executive order creating affirmative action. The bottom right picture is a labor demonstration around affirmative action in the late 1960s, around 1970. What do these episodes have in common? What we might call state-led democratization. What unites these episodes is the broad and forceful engagement of the national state, the federal government, both to set standards, to articulate standards, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, articulate national standards for how these things are supposed to happen. What kind of behavior do we expect from citizens and from governments, right? And what role do states play in this federated system, right? But also bringing the coercive apparatus of the federal government to bear, the administrative state, the military, right? In both Reconstructions, the military was critical. Associational connections, organizational connections between civil society and the federal government, and the fiscal authority of the state, right? And just this is a lot of small type, which I'm not going to read. We're happy to talk about these things. But if you look at these two episodes of democratization, they, relative to other periods in American history, what unites them, what links them, what makes them different from other times in American history is the presence of the national government as a promoter and guarantor uniformly across the country more than other periods. So, you know, this is a sort of, I first made this chart during the pandemic, and I was in the UK where they had this traffic light system for what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. Green light, red light, yellow light. So green is good, red is bad, yellow is meh. But you can see what distinguishes the Reconstruction era and the Civil Rights era from the two episodes that came right after those, right? That's when you see backsliding happen. So look at the immediate post-Reconstruction era, right? This is the period of mass disenfranchisement of Blacks in the South, among other things, right? You can see the slide after the second Reconstruction, the slide into backsliding is a little bit slower burning, right? But the question I think that we're left with, and sadly, I don't have any answers to this, but I'm hoping my colleagues and all of you will be able to help us answer this question is, where does the third Reconstruction come from? Right? What are the forces that are going to not just reverse the threats, the sort of contextual threats, but recreate a sense of energy and commitment on the part of the national government, right? This is not a local problem. This is not a problem that we can address piecemeal, but that needs to come from the center and from the top, right? Where does the energy come from, and where does the commitment come from? That, I think, is the existential problem that the United States is facing. And unfortunately, this is an empty slide. I wish I had an answer to that question, but I think that's the urgent question. So thank you very much. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks very, very much, Rob. I have just a few questions, and then I'm really looking forward to turning it over to all of you for your questions. Rob, I'd written down what were the things that resolved democratic crises in the past, and you gave us a sense of what those were. My second question, which followed from that, was whether they give you any hope about the future, or if they just articulate kind of how massive the challenge is for trying to imagine this third Reconstruction.
Yeah, in my despairing moments, of which there are many, it's very hard to see hope. It's hard to see where does the energy come from, as I said, to recapture the sense of focus and commitment and energy at the center that's going to make this possible. I mean, ultimately, I think, I guess one way to think about this is ultimately, I think we need some kind of national commitment and national engagement of the national government. This is not a problem, as I said, that can be solved piecemeal. At the same time, there are in smaller places, within states, at the local level, I think there is increasingly energy around some of these things. So I think, local commitment, taking on gerrymandering, for example. Gerrymandering is a small problem. It's a big problem, but it's a small part of the equation, right? It, by itself, for example, getting rid of partisan gerrymandering is not going to restore democratic vitality, right? But it's an indicator of the idea that's taken hold throughout a lot of the American political system, that once you're in control of the government, you can use your control of the government to sort of tilt the playing field in your favor, to make it harder for your opponents to win in the future, right? That's the underlying idea, right? And if even in smaller venues and states and local governments, we can take on that one place at a time, maybe it bubbles up from there. I wish I had something more sort of hopeful and optimistic to say.
No, you didn't. We'll try and draw out some hope, but you didn't talk very much about Donald Trump, which is not nice of you in some ways, but it's important, I think, right? Because we often sort of lay at the feet of Donald Trump all of the blame for the degradation of American politics, but it's actually been a longer run thing. But can you just historically sort of reflect for us on actually is he symptomatic, or is there something special, not special, but is there something
Very special.
something unique and special that he brought into American politics that has accelerated this?
I think by and large, he's symptomatic, right? And this was, the degradation of American democracy and these threats that I described at the beginning of the talk and in the book pre-existed Donald Trump. And in fact, I think they set the stage for the election of someone like Donald Trump. So I think by and large, Trump is a symptom. Number one. Number two, Trump is not, when we look beyond the United States, Trump is not unique, right? There are other democratic countries that have elected or come very close to electing these sort of right-wing, populist, nativist, racist, anti-immigrant politicians, right? So there's something that suggests that it's not just Trump. There's some set of forces in democracies around the world that are pushing electorates, resentful electorates who feel like some kind of status or power is being taken away from them. There's something impelling those places to elect people like Trump or give them a lot of votes. So that's another, I think, indicator that this is not just Trump. That said, Trump has an unerring instinct for making whatever situation he's in worse. And when he was, I always used to think, he was just kind of a little bit of a bumbler. He's clearly not that. It's not a smart man, but he's really good at sort of stirring the pot in strategic ways, whether in his business career or his entertainment career or now in his political career. So he's able to make things worse in ways that benefit him. And I have to say, watching the January 6th hearings over the course of the summer and then yesterday, when it was clear from the very beginning of those hearings that committee was going to put him right at the center of the story, the narrative that they were constructing. And I was a little bit skeptical of that at the beginning. I think they've done a phenomenal job of creating that narrative that puts him at the center of, the events that led to the insurrection on January 6th. So I haven't totally revised my view of Trump, but increasingly, I think he has been an active, engaged antagonist of American democracy in ways that I'm not sure I would have seen a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I want to ask you about the committee, and I want to ask you about the parties. Let's just stay on the committee for a second. I think what strikes me as remarkable about that committee is one, just the sheer display of political expertise at the core of it. That this is a group that understood that they had a long-term case to prosecute here, that they were going to do it in front of the public, and the combination of just dogged prosecution and showmanship. I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but the drama of it has been remarkable. And yet, one really has to wonder if this is going to enter the historical record in the way the Watergate committee did, for example, because it seems like half the country at least is just not listening. So what does that committee tell us about the capacity of Congress and its formal tools to actually engage in holding a bandit president to democratic account?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I was, if you hadn't brought up Watergate, I would have. As anyone who knows me knows, I became utterly obsessed with Watergate in 2017. Mostly because as Suzanne and I were writing this book, and we talked to each other almost every day, and we, there were every day, you can, as you all remember, right, during the Trump years, there was some new crazy tweet or outrage or something, and every day we'd think, oh my God, it can't possibly get any worse, and the next day it would be worse. And what drew me to the Watergate analogy was how long are the Republicans going to stick with this guy? And how long did the Republicans stick with Nixon in 1974? And the answer is almost until the very end. Almost until the very end. Those hearings were equally stage managed and orchestrated. Same kind of thing. The investigators would uncover things in the background, and then there would be a public hearing, so the revelation of the tapes in the Oval Office or something, they had uncovered this the week before it was publicly revealed. Because John Dean, who was one of their key informants, said, it was weird when Nixon was in the Oval Office and we were talking, sometimes it would be like, he wasn't talking directly to me. He was like, talking into the plant or something like that. And I began to wonder, Dean said, is there a recording system in the Oval Office? And so the investigators found the guy who had installed the taping system in the Oval Office, and he said, they were under oath, he revealed it. And then they put him on television, and they said, Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of a taping system in the Oval Office? And there's this long pause. And he says, he almost mumbles, yes, I'm aware of a taping system, right? So that was an example of the same kind of stage managed, carefully orchestrated moment. And the sort of same kind of both dogged and showmanly, right. What happened, but it was the end game. It's the end game of the Watergate hearing. Sorry, I'm going on too long about this, but it's the end game of the Watergate hearings that's particularly fascinating, because ultimately, after the tapes, the final batch of tapes are revealed, and the smoking gun tape, the tape where he and Haldeman are actually, conspiring in the Oval Office to obstruct the FBI's investigation of the Watergate break-in, which is a crime, right? Then they've got him dead to rights. And at that point, even the Republicans say, yeah, no, we can't. We just can't, right? Delegation, Barry Goldwater and a couple other guys go up to the White House and say, Mr. President, we're not telling you what to do, but you don't have the votes in the Senate to survive a trial. And he resigned. So, but it wasn't until literally the last week that Republicans abandoned him. But at the same time, the hearings were part of this sort of multi-part investigation. There were the hearings in Congress, there were Justice Department, FBI investigations, and a bunch of other prosecutorial investigations that were journalists uncovering things. You've got the same complex of things going on here, right? You've got the hearings and the committee and its investigation. You've got the Justice Department and a bunch of other investigations. You've got journalists uncovering things all the time. And once you filter out the sort of amusing, salacious bits, right? There's a picture of a criminal being built. But at the same time, the difference is he still seems to have this hold on fellow Republicans, and the fate of these 10 Republican House members who voted to impeach him the second time around is not encouraging for Republicans who know privately what he is, but are now, unless they're willing to kill their political careers, are not likely to step up as Republicans did sort of as a group in 1974 and say, okay, this guy has to go or we can't keep doing this. That's what I fear is the difference. Maybe he'll be indicted for something. Maybe there will be a way to sort of hold him accountable, Trump particularly accountable, but it's not clear how that by itself changes the trajectory of the Republican Party at this point, which I think is a deeper problem.
Yeah, I want to talk about the parties a little bit. So there was a theory of their, in retrospect, pretty short-lived prominence in political science in the 2000s around parties deciding, and the basic claim was that for all the to and fro of primaries and of these seemingly insurgent challengers coming up through parties, challenging establishments, in the end, party establishments choose the leader of the party. And that's certainly, that kind of claim has some fidelity if you look at the last Democratic primary, which in the end chose Joe Biden. You might have predicted it early on, but you wouldn't have thought it if you were watching things as they unfolded, but that's how it ended up. But it's hard to really, and so the notion there is that parties are ultimately kind of the center of gravity, and they're the disciplining agents who are going to make sure that the politicians that they put up are largely within the ideological streams of the party and are going to comport themselves in a way that's good for the party in the end. Trump does seem to upend that, right? If you look at Trump's ideology, for example, we've got Simon was probably thought he was going to be the first one to talk about Bayesian error terms, but if you but there's a paper in the GOP that kind of looks at which I wrote, but which looks at kind of Trump's ideology and the uncertainty around his ideology, and he's the most ideologically uncertain candidate of the thousands who ran for Congress, for Senate, or for the presidency in the last 3 elections. And yet he somehow captured the party, and the party is now his party, such that one doesn't have to believe anything except that Trump is okay, Democrats are bad, and that we should kind of continue on a destructive streak. What was the role? So that's a long wind up to say, what role of parties in the past in terms of getting back on democratic track? Is there any hope here that the parties are going to play a constructive role in this, or do we have to give up on them playing some role in it?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things about this. One is, I think, and I'm not alone in this, you really have to weep for the Republican Party. The Republican Party, as it's currently constituted, certainly in national politics, has become pretty much an anti-democratic force in American politics. Right? They're the focus on, but even putting aside the sort of Trump cult of personality, the focus on the election denialism, on the, as I mentioned this very briefly in passing, the concerted effort to reformulate state election laws to give partisan officials more authority as opposed to sort of nonpartisan professional election administrators. That will make it easier to steal elections. Let's be blunt about it in the future. So I think one kind of an answer to that question is to worry deeply about the Republican Party as a force in American politics. And because of the way American politics is structured, there's no alternative if you're not a Democrat, right? So that's very troublesome. On the party decides question, I think the most interesting thing that I've read recently about this is a book by Larry James at the University of Minnesota called Democracy Under Fire. And Larry's argument is, and this is sort of an anti-party decides argument, the culprit in this book are primary elections, right? That undermine the idea and that the party decides, that somehow party insiders and party professionals decide, right? And especially the rules that have been in place for both parties for choosing presidential candidates since the 1960s and 1970s, right? Which give all the power to voters in state primaries. And we know that the people who vote in primaries, primary election turnout is usually very low. The people who vote in primaries are the most extreme, most committed. And so rather than a sort of group of professional politicians getting together to try and decide who is the candidate who among Democrats or among Republicans nationwide has the best chance of appealing to the most voters to win the election, right? Typically, parties will tend to nominate people who are extreme, people who speak to the communities that vote in primaries. Now, Biden's nomination is maybe a refutation of or a sort of piece of counter evidence, because Biden isn't an extreme anything. I don't know how that story will sort of fit into this narrative in the longer run. I think, as I said, I think Trump is a motivating. Is a motivator for both parties, and I think beating Trump was the thing that was most in everyone's mind, even the extremists in the Democratic Party. but I think this is a strong, I think it's a strong argument. We've got a system that rewards extremism, right? And as the parties pull apart, as those polarization pictures that I showed suggest, as the parties pull apart, that's only going to get worse.
Rob, for all those who've joined us online, I want to thank you very, very much for coming to listen to the talk. We're going to call this part of it to a close now and now have a Q&A in the room. So thanks very much to those of you who are online.